Welcome back to Ellen's Werewolf Romance Collection. I'm so happy to have you here in our circle as the winter chill sets in. Before we journey into the frozen territory of the Frostbane Pack, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Thank you for choosing to spend this moment with me. If you haven't already, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to join our pack. It's the best way to make sure you never miss a fated encounter. I'd love to know who's listening tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from. And as the story unfolds, feel free to engage in the comments. Highlight the moments that made your heart race. Now, grab a warm drink and settle in. It's time for a Christmas gift the Alpha King will never forget. Deep within the frozen heart of the Frostbane territory, Alpha King Fenris rules with a soul as cold as the mountain winds. For years, his wolf has been silent, hollowed by a missing piece of his soul. But on the eve of the winter solstice, an anonymous gift arrives, a restored relic of his father's past. It carries the intoxicating scent of mountain laurel and rain, a fragrance that awakens the primal beast within him. With one breath, the king's stoic mask shatters. He unleashes a roar that vibrates through the very foundations of the citadel, commanding his elite trackers to find the woman who left it. Gwen, a quiet restorer, meant only to soothe his loneliness, but she has accidentally triggered a hunt that will change their lives forever. Chapter 1. The Weight of History. Gwen's workshop was a sanctuary of aromatic oils, aged parchment, and the steady rhythmic scrape of bone folders against leather. While the rest of the Frostbane Pack prepared for the raucous celebrations of the winter solstice, she remained tucked away on the village outskirts, her attention focused on the heavy volume resting upon her workbench. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sweet mountain laurel, a fragrance that seemed to cling to the very walls of her home and infuse every fiber of her clothing. Every movement she made was deliberate and precise, her calloused fingers tracing the intricate gold leaf she had painstakingly reapplied to the cover of the journal. This was not merely a book. It was a fragment of a broken history, a collection of personal letters and memories belonging to the late Alpha King, a man whose lineage was now carried solely by his son, Fenris. For weeks, Gwen had labored in the dim light of tallow candles, piecing together the brittle pages that had been salvaged from the ruins of an old archive near the border. She had seen the way Fenris walked through the village, his shoulders broad and unyielding, carrying the weight of a kingdom that demanded strength while offering no warmth in return. To the rest of the pack, he was a legend of stone and ice, a ruler who had forgotten the sound of his own laughter and the touch of a companion. But Gwen, with her quiet observations and her deep connection to the past, saw the persistent hollowness in his eyes. She felt an unspoken tether to him, a magnetic pull that resonated in the marrow of her bones whenever he passed by. It was a foolish thing for a woman of her standing to feel for an Alpha King, yet it was the very thing that had driven her to this exhaustive task. As she applied the final coat of preservative oil to the restored leather, the scent of fresh rain and laurel intensified, blooming in the warmth of the small hearth. She knew the risks of what she was doing by choosing to interact with the monarch in any capacity. To send a gift to the Alpha King was to invite scrutiny, yet to send it anonymously was perhaps even more dangerous in a pack that thrived on transparency and loyalty. He was a man who lived by the blade and the ancient laws of their kind, and he did not take kindly to mysteries that breached his fortress walls. Yet, the thought of him spending another solstice without a single reminder of the family he had lost was a burden Gwen could no longer bear to witness from the sidelines. She carefully wrapped the journal in heavy linen, securing it with a simple twine that bore no mark of her identity or her craft. The village outside was a blur of white and gray as the blizzard began to howl, the wind rattling the wooden shutters of her workshop. Gwen pulled her thick woolen cloak tight around her frame, the fabric smelling of the mountain herbs she used to treat her parchments. She had lived her life in the shadows, a restorer of things forgotten, and she preferred the silence of her relics to the noise of the pack's rigid social hierarchies. Not a soul in the village knew of her secret project, and she intended to keep it that way. The journal was meant to be a silent mercy, a way to bridge the gap between a grieving son and a father who had been gone for far too long, not a bid for his attention. As she stepped out into the freezing night, the snow crunched beneath her boots with a sound like breaking glass. The citadel loomed above the village, a massive structure of dark stone that seemed to pierce the heavy, snow-laden clouds. It was a place of power and secrets, and the very thought of approaching its gates made Gwen's heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved with a purpose that defied her fear, weaving through the narrow alleys and past the festive lights of the tavern, where the warriors were already beginning their revelry. She was a flicker of movement that went unnoticed by the guards who were more concerned with external threats than a lone woman carrying a small package through the storm. The tether she felt toward Fenris seemed to vibrate as she neared the citadel, a physical sensation that guided her through the blinding white of the night. She reached the service entrance, a small wooden door used by the kitchen staff and the wood haulers that sat in the shadow of the main ramparts. With trembling hands, she placed the linen-wrapped gift upon the sheltered stone step, tucking it away from the drifting snow. She lingered for only a heartbeat, her gaze traveling upward to the high balcony where she knew the king often stood to watch over his people in solitary silence. She whispered a silent hope that the gift would find its way to him, unaware that she had just set into motion a chain of events that would strip away her anonymity forever. Chapter 2. The Fortress of Solitude. The high balcony of the citadel was a desolate throne of wind and ice, and Fenris stood upon it like a statue carved from the very mountain itself. Below him, the lights of the Frostbane village flickered like dying embers against the vast, oppressive white of the landscape. He could hear the distant, muffled sounds of his people preparing for the winter solstice, their laughter and songs carried upward on the frigid drafts. To them, the season was a time of warmth and communal strength, but to the Alpha King, it was merely another cycle of duty and silence. His heavy mantle of silver fox fur caught the snow, dusting his broad shoulders in a fine layer of frost that he did not bother to shake off. The cold did not bother him. It was the only thing that felt as consistent and reliable as the heavy crown he had worn since the day his father fell in battle. Inside his mind, his wolf was a restless, prowling shadow, pacing the perimeter of its mental cage with a low, constant hum of dissatisfaction. It had been years since the beast had felt anything resembling peace, and the void where a fated mate should have been was a jagged, aching hollow that never truly closed. Fenris had long ago accepted that he might lead his pack into the next generation without a queen by his side, but the acceptance did not make the isolation any easier to bear. He ruled with a cold efficiency that ensured the safety of his borders and the prosperity of his kin, yet he was a stranger to the very people he protected. He was the shield and the sword, a legend of stone that required no comfort and offered none in return. A role he played with such perfection that the lines between the man and the monarch had long since blurred into nothingness. He watched the movement of a lone figure near the service entrance far below, a small shadow that vanished into the storm as quickly as it had appeared. For a fleeting second, a strange sensation prickled at the base of his neck, a phantom tether that seemed to pull at his spirit, but he dismissed it as a trick of the swirling snow. There were no threats within the walls of his citadel that his guards could not handle, and he had no reason to suspect that a simple villager would dare to approach his private sanctuary. The wind shifted, bringing with it the metallic scent of impending ice and the faint, sweet aroma of roasting meats from the great hall. Yet neither could penetrate the numbness that had settled over his heart. He was a king in exile within his own fortress, surrounded by thousands but truly seen by no one, waiting for a solstice that held no promise of change. As the blizzard intensified, Fenris finally turned away from the edge, his heavy boots echoing against the dark stone floor of the balcony. He moved toward his private solar, a room filled with maps, ancient scrolls, and the heavy scent of old parchment and cedar wood. This was the only place where he allowed the mask of the Alpha King to slip, if only by a fraction. Here, the silence was not a burden, but a choice, a way to escape the constant demands of his advisors and the expectant stares of his warriors. He sat at his heavy oak desk, his large hands resting on the polished surface as he stared at the dying embers in the hearth. The emptiness in his chest seemed to expand in the quiet, a silent reminder that power was a poor substitute for the soul-deep connection his wolf craved. The isolation of the night was suddenly interrupted by a soft, hesitant knocking on the solar doors, pulling Fenris from his dark contemplations. He straightened his posture, the royal mask sliding back into place as he called for the visitor to enter. It was a young guard, his face flushed from the cold and his hands clutching a small, linen-wrapped package that looked entirely out of place in the grand room. The guard explained that the item had been found at the service gate, left without a name or a message, a mystery that had bypassed the usual security channels of the fortress. Fenris reached out to take the object, his fingers brushing against the rough fabric as he felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt of electricity shoot up his arm. The guard bowed and retreated, leaving the king alone with the small bundle that felt strangely heavy in his hands, as if it contained the weight of an entire world. Chapter 3. The Gatekeeper's Delivery. Fenris stared at the linen bundle resting on his desk, the flickering orange light of the dying fire casting long, dancing shadows across its unadorned surface. It was a humble thing, lacking the fine silk or royal seals that usually accompanied the tributes sent by neighboring packs or ambitious nobles. The lack of identification was a blatant violation of protocol, yet he found himself unable to call for the guards to have it inspected for poisons or traps. There was something undeniably honest about the package, a sense of quiet sincerity that resonated with the restless beast lurking beneath his skin. His wolf paced faster now, its nose twitching as if it were trying to catch a scent that the human side of Fenris was still too distracted to perceive. He picked up the bundle, noticing how the twine had been tied with a series of intricate, delicate knots that suggested a pair of skilled, patient hands had worked on them for hours. Slowly, almost tentatively, he began to unwrap the linen, the fabric falling away to reveal the dark, supple leather of a restored book. The moment his eyes landed on the golden crest embossed upon the spine, the breath left his lungs in a sudden, painful rush. It was his father's personal emblem, a symbol of a legacy he thought had been burned to ash along with the royal library during the Great War. He reached out to touch the leather, his fingertips trembling as they traced the familiar lines of the wolf and the mountain peak. The material was soft and warm, possessing a vitality that made it feel as though it were still alive, pulsating with the memories of the man who had once held it. This was not just a gift. It was a resurrection of a lost piece of his identity, a miracle delivered to his doorstep in the middle of a winter storm. The craftsmanship was flawless, every tear in the ancient parchment having been mended with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Fenris turned the pages with a reverence he had not felt in years, his heart hammering against his ribs as he recognized his father's bold, sweeping handwriting. These were the private thoughts of a king who had loved his people and his family, with a ferocity that Fenris had always struggled to emulate. As he read the first few lines, the cold walls of the citadel seemed to melt away, replaced by the warmth of a history he had been forced to leave behind. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a raw vulnerability that he had spent an entire decade suppressing in order to become the stoic leader his pack required. Someone in his village had found this treasure and spent their own time and resources to bring it back to life, all without asking for credit or reward. The silence of the solar was now heavy with the ghosts of the past, the memories of his father's voice echoing in the quiet corners of the room. Fenris realized that the gift was more than just a historical artifact. It was a message of empathy, a silent acknowledgement of the loneliness he carried so successfully. He wondered who among his subjects possessed the skill to restore such a relic and the heart to give it away so freely. The mystery of the giver began to consume him, competing with the overwhelming emotions brought forth by the journal itself. He felt a sudden, desperate need to know the identity of the person who had walked through the blizzard just to bring him this small piece of peace. He leaned closer to the book, intending to examine the bindings more closely, but as he did, a new sensation hit him with the force of a tidal wave. A fragrance began to rise from the pages as they were exposed to the warmth of the solar, a scent that had nothing to do with old paper or leather. It was a vibrant, floral sweetness that seemed to bloom in the air, cutting through the smell of cedar and ash like a ray of sunlight. The aroma was so distinct and so powerful that Fenris felt his vision blur for a momentary second. It was the scent of mountain laurel in full bloom, mingled with the clean, electric freshness of a summer rainstorm. This was not a scent he had ever encountered in the frozen peaks of the north, yet it felt more familiar to him than his own heartbeat. His wolf suddenly stopped its pacing, its entire being focused on the fragrance that was now filling the king's lungs and racing through his bloodstream like liquid fire. Chapter 4. The Scent of Mountain Laurel. The scent of mountain laurel and rain continued to bloom within the solar, growing more potent with every passing second as the warmth of the hearth liberated the oils trapped in the leather. Fenris sat frozen in his chair, his hands still gripping the edges of the journal as his mind struggled to process the biological explosion occurring in his senses. This was the scent he had dreamed of during the coldest nights of his life, the one fragrance that his soul had been searching for since the day he reached maturity. It was the calling card of a fated mate, a physical and spiritual anchor that designated one female out of thousands as his perfect match. The realization hit him with a physical force that made his lungs seize, the sheer impossibility of the situation clashing with the undeniable truth vibrating in his marrow. His wolf took full control then, its golden eyes burning with a light that pushed back the shadows of the room. The beast was no longer a silent observer. It was a dominant predator that had finally found the trail of its queen. Every instinct Fenris possessed shouted at him to move, to hunt, and to claim the woman who had left this essence behind. He realized with a terrifying clarity that the person who had restored his father's journal was the same person whose soul was entwined with his own. She had stood at his gate. She had touched this leather with her bare hands, and she had walked away into the night without saying a word. The thought of her wandering alone in the blizzard, unaware that she had just ignited the most powerful bond in existence, filled him with a frantic, protective rage that he could barely contain. He pressed his face into the center of the journal, inhaling deep lungfuls of the laurel and rain until his entire world was reduced to that single intoxicating fragrance. It was a scent of life and growth, a direct contrast to the world of stone and ice he had built around himself. He could see her in his mind, though he had never laid eyes on her. A woman of patience and hidden strength, someone who cared for the broken pieces of the world until they were whole again. The tether he had felt earlier on the balcony was no longer a phantom sensation. It was a glowing, white-hot cord that connected his heart to hers, pulling him toward the village with a gravity he could not resist. He felt the animalistic need to mark her, to protect her, and to never let her go, a hunger so deep it threatened to swallow his human reason entirely. The king stood up, the heavy oak chair screeching against the floor as it was shoved back by his sudden movement. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the alpha power coiled in his muscles like a spring. He looked down at the journal, which was now more than just a relic. It was a map and a promise. The female who had handled these pages was still out there, her scent still fresh enough to be tracked by a wolf of his caliber. He would not allow the darkness of the night or the chaos of the storm to hide her from him any longer. The time for stoicism and silence was over. The king had found his mate, and the entire kingdom was about to learn what happened when a frozen heart was finally touched by the heat of a fated flame. He moved toward the door, his steps heavy and purposeful, the power of his presence causing the air in the hallway to vibrate. He could feel the eyes of the ancient kings watching him from their portraits, their silent approval echoing through the corridors as he prepared to announce his discovery. The hunt was not just a necessity, It was an act of destiny that could not be delayed by a single second. He knew the scent of mountain laurel would lead him through the snow and into the arms of the woman who had saved him with an anonymous gift. As he reached for the handle of the solar door, he felt the roar building in his chest, a sound of triumph and demand that would signal the end of his exile. The North was about to wake up to a new era, one defined by the scent of rain and the power of a king who had finally found his reason to rule. Chapter 5. The Roar That Shook the Mountain. The Alpha King threw open the doors of his solar, stepping out into the grand hallway with a presence so overwhelming that the nearby torches flickered and dimmed. He did not call for his servants or wait for his advisors. Instead, he threw his head back and unleashed a roar that tore through the silence of the citadel. It was a sound of raw, unbridled power, a sonic wave that traveled through the stone foundations and erupted into the night air. In the village below, the windows rattled in their frames, and the dogs began to howl in a frantic chorus of submission. Every member of the Frostbane pack, from the youngest pup to the oldest elder, felt the roar in their very bones, recognizing the ancient call of an alpha who had found his fated match and was claiming her before the creators. Within seconds, the corridors were filled with the sound of running feet as the elite guard scrambled to respond to the king's summons. Fletcher, the lead tracker, was the first to arrive, his face pale and his eyes wide as he witnessed the golden glow radiating from the king's eyes. Fenris did not wait for a report. He pointed back toward the open journal on his desk, the scent of laurel and rain now pouring out into the hallway like a visible mist. He commanded Fletcher to gather every tracker in the citadel and to bring the scent hounds to the solar immediately. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that brooked no hesitation, informing the men that a female of the pack had delivered a gift to the service entrance, and that she was to be found before the sun rose over the peaks. "Track the scent and bring her to me," Fenris bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the great hall as the warriors assembled. He explained that the fragrance of mountain laurel and fresh rain was the mark of his mate, and that the hunt was to be carried out with the utmost urgency and care. He warned his men that not a single hair on her head was to be harmed, for she was already the queen of the north in the eyes of his wolf. The trackers bowed low, their own instincts heightening as they caught the first hints of the intoxicating scent drifting from the king's private quarters. They knew that this was the most important hunt in the history of the Frostbane pack, a mission that would determine the future of their entire lineage. Fletcher took a final, deep breath of the air in the solar, memorizing the specific chemical signature of the mountain laurel. He nodded to the king, his expression one of grim determination, before turning to lead his men out into the blizzard. The search would be systematic and relentless, a house-to-house sweep of the territory that would leave no stone unturned. Behind them, Fenris stood at the head of the great staircase, his hands gripping the stone railing so hard that the rock began to crack beneath his strength. He was a predator waiting for his prize, his heart synchronized with the footsteps of the men who were now descending into the village to find the woman who had restored his soul. The hunt was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability that would change the course of their lives forever. As the heavy gates of the citadel groaned open to let the tracking parties out, Gwen sat in her workshop, listening to the echoes of the roar as they faded into the wind. She felt a cold shiver of dread wash over her, misinterpreting the king's primal call as a sign of fury rather than a declaration of love. She had seen the power of Fenris when he was angered, and the sound she had just heard was more intense than anything she had ever experienced. Fearing that her gift had been taken as an insult or a threat to his authority, she began to move through her shop, blowing out the candles and gathering her things in a desperate attempt to disappear. She did not know that the king was not coming for her head, but for her heart, and that the very scent she used in her work was now the beacon that would lead him directly to her door. Chapter 6. The Misinterpreted Command. The roar of the Alpha King did not merely echo through the streets of the village, it felt like a physical strike against the wooden walls of Gwen's workshop. She was in the middle of cleaning her tools when the sound hit, a deep, guttural vibration that made the glass jars on her shelves rattle precariously. Her heart lurched into her throat, the rhythmic thudding of her pulse suddenly out of sync with the world around her. To anyone else, that sound might have carried the weight of a royal announcement, but to Gwen, it sounded like the herald of a death sentence. She stood paralyzed for a long moment, her fingers clutching a small metal scraper so tightly that the edges bit into her skin. She had spent weeks pouring her soul into that journal, meticulously reviving the memories of a fallen ruler, all in the hope of bringing a flicker of peace to Fenris. Now, the sheer violence of his reaction suggested she had committed a grave transgression instead of an act of kindness. Panic, cold and sharp, began to bloom in the center of her chest as she realized the potential consequences of her anonymity. In the rigid hierarchy of the Frostbane pack, mystery was often equated with subversion or threat, and she had just handed the king a piece of his most personal history without a name or a face attached to it. Perhaps he saw the journal as a taunt from an enemy, or a cruel reminder of the vulnerabilities he had worked so hard to bury beneath his icy exterior. She could already hear the distant, frantic ringing of the bells at the citadel, signaling that the king's guard was being mobilized for a purpose that could only be related to her gift. The silence of her workshop, which had always been her greatest comfort, now felt like a cage that was slowly closing in on her. She knew the trackers would be dispatched within minutes, and their senses were far too keen for her to remain in the village once the search began in earnest. She moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy, grabbing a sturdy leather rucksack from beneath her workbench and stuffing it with a few essential supplies. She threw in a hunk of dried meat, a heavy wool blanket, and the small tin of mountain laurel oil that she used for her finest work. The scent of the oil filled the small room, a bitter irony that made her eyes sting with unshed tears. She had used that very fragrance to bless the journal, thinking it would offer the king a sense of calm and renewal, but now it felt like a brand that would lead his executioners directly to her door. She didn't stop to look back at the sanctuary she had built over the years, the place where she had felt safe and useful despite her low status in the pack. Every second she lingered was a second closer to the moment Fletcher and his men would kick in her door and drag her before the king to answer for a crime she never intended to commit. Gwen extinguished the last of her candles, plunging the workshop into a gray, shadowy darkness that matched the storm raging outside. She slipped through the back door, her boots sinking deep into the fresh snow as she moved toward the edge of the forest. The wind was a howling entity that tore at her cloak, but she welcomed its fury, hoping it would help mask her trail and confuse the hounds. She was not a warrior or a hunter, just a woman who understood the language of old things, and she had no idea how to survive in the wilderness during a blizzard of this magnitude. Yet, the fear of the king's roar was a more potent motivator than the fear of the cold, driving her deep into the black expanse of the whispering woods. As she vanished into the trees, the first flickers of torchlight appeared in the distance, marking the beginning of the most terrifying night of her life. Chapter 7. Fletcher's First Lead. Fletcher stood in the center of the village square, his breath coming in heavy, white plumes that vanished into the swirling snow. Beside him, the elite tracking unit waited in a tense, disciplined silence, their hands resting on the hilts of their blades and their eyes scanning the darkened houses. The king's command still rang in Fletcher's ears, a decree of such absolute power that it left no room for doubt or hesitation. He held a small piece of the linen wrap that had been salvaged from the king's solar, the fabric still saturated with the hauntingly sweet scent of mountain laurel and fresh rain. To his highly trained senses, the fragrance was like a physical thread, a vibrant line of color drawn across a canvas of gray and white. It was a scent of life and spring, something so rare and beautiful in this desolate land that it felt almost sacred. The villagers had begun to emerge from their homes, their faces pale with confusion and fear as they witnessed the mobilization of the royal guard. Fletcher ignored their whispered questions, his focus entirely on the invisible trail that was beginning to materialize before him. He signaled for the hounds to be brought forward, the massive, thick-furred beasts straining at their leashes as they caught the first hint of the laurel. They didn't growl or snap as they usually did during a hunt. Instead, they whined with a strange, high-pitched urgency, their tails tucked between their legs as they looked toward the outskirts of the village. Even the animals seemed to recognize the weight of the alpha's claim, their instincts aligning with the king's desperate need to find the source of the fragrance. Fletcher felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple despite the freezing temperature, realizing that the person they were looking for was likely terrified of the very power they had awakened. He began the house-to-house search with a grim efficiency, moving from one dwelling to the next with a speed that left the villagers reeling. He wasn't looking for weapons or contraband. He was looking for a lingering aroma, a trace of the mountain laurel that would betray the identity of the gift-giver. Most of the homes smelled of wet wool, pine needles, and hearth fire, the typical scents of a pack hunkered down for the winter. But as they approached the northern edge of the village, the air began to change, the sharp scent of the storm being replaced by a faint, floral sweetness that made Fletcher's heart hammer in his chest. He could feel the king's presence behind him, a dark, looming shadow of authority that urged them forward with a silent, relentless pressure. The trail was growing warmer, the scent becoming more concentrated as they moved toward a small, isolated structure that sat apart from the rest of the community. The guards fanned out, surrounding the workshop as Fletcher stepped toward the door, his hand raised to deliver a command to enter. The scent here was undeniable, a thick, intoxicating cloud of laurel and rain that seemed to emanate from the very wood of the building. He could see the faint indentations of boots in the snow, a trail of frantic footsteps that led away from the back of the house and disappeared into the dense tree line of the Whispering Woods. A sense of foreboding settled over him as he realized the girl had fled, her fear of the king likely outweighing her trust in his mercy. He kicked open the door, his weapon drawn, but the room was empty and cold, the only movement being the gentle flickering of a dying ember in the hearth. He knew he had found the right place, but as he looked out at the dark, unforgiving forest, he realized that the hunt had only just begun. Chapter 10. The Warrior's Scorn. Morgana stood on the high ramparts of the citadel. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the torches of the tracking parties move through the village like a line of fire ants. She was a woman built for war, her body a collection of scars and hardened muscle that she wore with a fierce, unwavering pride. For years, she had positioned herself as the most logical choice for the king's mate, a warrior queen who could match his strength and hold his territory with a cold, ruthless efficiency. She had stood by his side through every border skirmish and every internal challenge, waiting for the day his wolf would recognize the loyalty and power she offered. But the roar she had heard earlier had not been for her. It had been for a scent, a fragrance of flowers and rain that felt like an insult to everything she represented. She turned away from the wall, her cape swirling around her ankles as she marched back toward the great hall. Her blood was boiling with a mixture of jealousy and disbelief, her mind refusing to accept that a common girl could succeed where she had failed. She knew every high-ranking female in the Frostbane pack, and not one of them carried the scent of mountain laurel. That particular aroma was associated with the lowliest members of their society, the healers and restorers who worked with the discarded remnants of the past. To think that Fenris would throw his kingdom into chaos for an Omega or a simple artisan was a humiliation she could not endure. She had spent a lifetime proving her worth, and she was not about to let her future be derailed by a woman who hid in the shadows and sent anonymous tokens of affection. As she passed the king's solar, she caught a stray breath of the fragrance that had ignited the madness. It was sweet, cloying, and altogether too soft for a pack that lived on the edge of the world. To Morgana, the scent didn't represent life. It represented weakness, a vulnerability that would eventually lead to the king's downfall. If Fenris took a mate who was not a warrior, the Frostbane pack would lose its edge, and their enemies would see the shift as a sign of softening. She saw herself as the true protector of the crown, the one who had to make the difficult choices the king was currently too blinded by instinct to make. If he found this girl, he would be compromised, his focus split between his duty and his heart, and that was a risk Morgana was not willing to take for the sake of a fated bond she didn't believe in. She slipped into the shadows of a side corridor, her movements as silent as a ghost as she avoided the frantic guards and servants. She didn't need a tracking unit or a pack of hounds to find the girl. She had spent years learning the secrets of the village and the habits of its people. She remembered a quiet, mousy woman who worked at the edge of the territory, a restorer of relics who always smelled of herbs and old leather. If that woman was the one who had sent the gift, she would likely be heading for the only place where a non-warrior could hope to hide, the deep caves beyond the Whispering Woods. Morgana felt a cold, sharp smile touch her lips as she reached for her silver-tipped dagger, the blade gleaming in the dim torchlight. She would find the girl first, and she would ensure that the Alpha King never had to worry about the scent of mountain laurel again. Chapter 9. Into the Shadows. Gwen stumbled through the deep snow, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that burned her throat. The Whispering Woods were a labyrinth of ancient pines and jagged rock, a place where the wind didn't just howl but seemed to scream with 1,000 ghostly voices. She could hear the distant baying of the hounds, a sound that chilled her more than the freezing air, telling her that her flight had been discovered. She was moving blindly, her vision obscured by the heavy snowfall and the darkness of the night, but the tether in her chest continued to pull her forward with an agonizing intensity. It was as if a string were tied to her heart, and every step she took away from the citadel made the tension tighter, a physical pain that threatened to snap her spirit in two. The forest was a predatory thing, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag her cloak and scratch at her face. She fell several times, her knees hitting the frozen ground with a jarring impact, but she forced herself to keep moving, driven by a primal terror that she couldn't fully explain. She didn't understand why the king was hunting her with such ferocity, or why his roar had sounded so much like a claim. In her mind, she was just a restorer, a woman of no importance who had made a mistake that had put her entire life at risk. She thought of her workshop, the quiet hours she had spent with the journal, and the way she had felt so connected to the history of the pack while she worked. Now that history felt like a weight that was dragging her down into the abyss, a legacy that she was not worthy to touch, let hand over to a king. As she pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of the village began to fade, replaced by the oppressive silence of the high mountain. The trees here were thicker, their trunks scarred by the claws of generations of wolves, and the air was thin and biting. Gwen felt her strength beginning to fail, her limbs growing heavy and her thoughts becoming a muddled blur of fear and exhaustion. She found a small outcrop of rock that offered a meager shelter from the wind, huddling beneath the stone as she tried to catch her breath. The scent of the laurel oil in her bag was a constant reminder of the trail she was leaving behind, a beacon that she couldn't extinguish no matter how hard she tried. She realized then that she couldn't outrun the king's trackers, not in a storm like this, and not with a scent that was so fundamentally linked to her soul. She pulled the heavy wool blanket around her shoulders, her teeth chattering so hard they made a rhythmic clicking sound in the quiet. She thought of Fenris, the way he had looked from her window as he walked through the square, a man of iron who carried the world on his back. If she died out here in the cold, would he ever know that she only wanted to help him? Would he ever realize that the gift was meant to be a light in his darkness, not a threat to his peace? The thought of him never knowing the truth was almost as painful as the cold, a deep, hollow ache that made her want to weep. But as the sound of snapping branches echoed through the trees, she knew she couldn't afford the luxury of grief. The hunters were closing in, and she had to find a way to survive the night if she ever wanted to see the spring again. Chapter 10. The King Joins the Trail. Fenris could no longer endure the suffocating walls of the citadel, his wolf demanding a direct role in the reclamation of its mate. He had descended from the fortress like a storm cloud, his presence casting a heavy pall over the village as he walked through the snowy streets. He didn't need the torches or the hounds to show him the way. The scent of mountain laurel was a physical pull in his gut, a magnetic force that grew stronger with every step he took toward the northern edge of the territory. He moved past his warriors with a single-minded intensity, his eyes fixed on the small workshop that stood at the end of the line. The air around him seemed to crackle with the energy of his alpha bond, the very snow melting beneath his boots as his internal temperature rose to meet the heat of his primal need. He reached the workshop just as Fletcher was preparing to lead the next phase of the search into the forest. The king stepped through the shattered door, his gaze sweeping over the modest room with a mixture of reverence and agony. He could see the evidence of her life everywhere, the organized shelves of parchment, the jars of oils, and the heavy workbench where his father's journal had been lovingly restored. He reached out to touch the wood of the table, his fingers tracing a faint smudge of ink that had not yet fully dried. The scent here was so thick, it was almost overwhelming, a concentrated essence of the woman who had touched his soul without even knowing his name. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret as he realized he had terrified her, his roar of joy and claiming having been misinterpreted as a cry of war. "She went into the woods," Fletcher reported, his voice low and respectful as he pointed toward the back of the building. Fenris followed the tracker's gaze, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the dark, treacherous expanse of the Whispering Woods. He could see the small, uneven footprints in the snow, the signs of a woman who was running for her life from a man who only wanted to protect her. A growl vibrated in his chest, not directed at her, but at the circumstances that had forced her into the cold. He knew how dangerous those woods could be during a solstice blizzard, and the thought of his mate being lost in the darkness made his wolf howl with a frantic, agonizing desperation. He wouldn't let her suffer another minute of fear. He would find her, and he would show her that the Alpha King was not a monster to be feared, but a man who had finally found his home. He found a small scrap of parchment tucked into a corner of the workbench, a fragment that had been cut away during the restoration process. It bore a small, hand-drawn sketch of his father's crest, the lines identical to the ones on the journal he now carried close to his heart. It was the final proof he needed, a tangible link between the girl and the gift that had changed everything. He tucked the scrap into his tunic, the paper warm against his skin, before turning back to Fletcher with an expression of absolute resolve. "I lead the hunt from here," he stated, his voice a command that no one would dare to challenge. As he stepped out into the blizzard, his silver-white fur began to sprout along his arms, the king shifting into his massive wolf form to better track the woman who held his destiny in her hands. Chapter 11. The Empty Workshop. Fenris stood in the center of the humble workshop, his massive frame making the small space feel even more cramped and fragile. The scent of mountain laurel was so thick here that it felt like a living entity, wrapping around his senses and anchoring his restless wolf to the spot. While his trackers prepared for the push into the forest, the king allowed himself a moment to truly look at the place where his mate had spent her days. It was a room dedicated to the preservation of things that time had tried to erase, filled with the tools of a patient and meticulous soul. He saw the jars of binding glue, the delicate brushes, and the stacks of aged parchment that had been rescued from the brink of decay. This was not the home of a social climber or a woman seeking power. It was the sanctuary of someone who found beauty in the broken and value in the forgotten. His gaze fell upon a stray scrap of parchment resting near the edge of the workbench, a fragment that had been trimmed during the final stages of the journal's restoration. He picked it up with a gentle touch that belied his immense strength, his eyes narrowing as he studied the intricate sketches of his father's royal crest. Below the drawing, in a soft and fluid script, were the words, "For the king who remembers." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, more powerful than any weapon he had ever faced in battle. She had not sent the gift as a bribe or a bid for attention. She had sent it as a mercy. She had looked at the stoic, frozen king and seen the grieving son hidden beneath the crown, and she had chosen to give him back a piece of his own heart without ever asking for a single thing in return. The emptiness of the workshop began to echo with the weight of that silent kindness, making the king's chest ache with a sudden, overwhelming vulnerability. He had spent his entire life being treated as a weapon or a symbol, a figure of authority to be feared or placated, but this woman had seen him as a person. She had noticed his loneliness in a way that not a single member of his inner circle had ever dared to acknowledge. The journal was an act of profound empathy, a bridge built between two souls who lived on opposite ends of the pack's hierarchy. He realized then that he had almost lost the only person in the world who truly understood him, all because he had allowed his own dominance to scream louder than his heart. The scent of laurel in the room was a lingering promise, a trail of hope that led directly into the darkness of the blizzard. A growl of pure, unadulterated resolve vibrated in his throat as he folded the scrap of parchment and tucked it safely against his skin. He was no longer just hunting a mate. He was hunting the woman who had saved his soul from the eternal winter of his own making. Every second she spent out in the cold was a second that weighed heavily on his conscience, a debt of protection that he was desperate to repay. He looked at the heavy door that had been kicked open by his guards and felt a surge of protective fury toward anything that might try to harm her. She was a restorer of relics, a gentle light in a harsh world, and he would tear the very mountains down before he allowed her to be extinguished by the storm. With a final, lingering look at the workbench, Fenris stepped back out into the night, his wolf taking over the hunt with a renewed and terrifying purpose. Chapter 12. Morgana's Shadow Hunt. Morgana moved through the dense undergrowth of the Whispering Woods with the lethal grace of a predator who had spent her entire life mastering the art of the kill. She had successfully separated herself from the main body of the King's Guard, slipping into the shadows like a ghost that refused to be seen. Her jealousy was a cold, sharp blade in her gut, driving her forward with a speed that rivaled the King's most elite trackers. She didn't need the hounds to tell her where the girl was headed. She knew the terrain of the Frostbane territory better than anyone, and she understood the desperate logic of the frightened. To her, the scent of mountain laurel was not a beacon of hope, but a stench of weakness that threatened to infect the very foundations of their pack's strength. She paused for a moment beneath the heavy canopy of an ancient pine, her ears twitching as she caught the distant sound of breaking branches and the frantic, shallow breathing of someone who was nearly at their limit. A cruel smile touched her lips, the silver-tipped dagger in her hand catching the faint, filtered light of the moon. She saw herself as the savior of the pack, the only one willing to do the dark work required to keep the king's focus on his duty. If Fenris were to claim a common artisan as his mate, the strength of their lineage would be diluted, and the enemies who watched their borders would see it as a sign of irreversible softening. Morgana believed that blood and iron were the only things that kept a kingdom whole, and she was prepared to spill the former to ensure the latter remained unbroken. The warrior moved silently toward the source of the sound, her boots barely making a dent in the deep snow as she calculated the best angle of attack. She didn't want to fight. She wanted a clean, quiet end to a problem that never should have existed in the first place. She would make it look like the girl had succumbed to the elements, or perhaps been attacked by one of the rogue wolves that prowled the periphery of their land. No one would ever suspect the loyal warrior who had stood by the king for a decade, and the scent of mountain laurel would eventually fade from the citadel, becoming nothing more than a half-forgotten memory of a winter solstice. She pushed through a screen of frost-covered ferns, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a flicker of a dark cloak moving through the trees ahead. As she closed the distance, her wolf stirred within her, a creature of cold ambition that felt no remorse for the task at hand. Morgana had long ago suppressed any sense of empathy or sisterhood, viewing them as obstacles to the power she craved. She watched Gwen stumble and fall, the girl's exhaustion evident in every labored movement, yet Morgana felt no pity for the woman who had managed to touch the king's heart with a simple book. To her, the fated bond was a biological glitch, a primitive urge that had no place in the modern administration of a kingdom. She raised her blade, the silver edge gleaming with a lethal promise, and prepared to strike before the trackers could close the gap. The shadow hunt was reaching its climax, and Morgana was determined to be the one who decided the future of the Frostbane throne. Chapter 13. Cold Trails and Warm Blood. Gwen's vision was beginning to blur as the freezing air clawed at her lungs, each breath feeling like she was inhaling shards of jagged ice. The blizzard had transformed the Whispering Woods into a nightmare of white and gray, a place where every tree looked identical, and every path led deeper into the heart of the storm. She reached out to steady herself against the trunk of a gnarled oak, but her hand slipped on the frozen bark, sending her crashing to the ground. As she tried to catch herself, a sharp, broken branch sliced through the thick wool of her mitten and into the palm of her hand. The pain was immediate and searing, a white-hot flash that cut through the numbness of her limbs and made her gasp in agony. She pulled her hand back, her eyes widening as she saw the dark crimson liquid beginning to seep into the pristine white of the snow. The scent of her blood was sharp and metallic, cutting through the sweetness of the mountain laurel with a sudden, violent urgency. In the world of the Frostbane pack, blood was a summons, a primal signal that triggered the predatory instincts of every wolf within a 5-mile radius. Gwen felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror wash over her as she realized she had just signaled her exact location to the very hunters she was trying to escape. She tried to wrap her cloak around her hand to stem the flow, but the damage was already done. The fragrance of her life force was being carried away by the wind, a beacon that no shifter could possibly ignore. Deep in the forest, the hounds let out a collective, blood-chilling howl that echoed off the mountain walls, their voices filled with a new and terrifying hunger. The hunt had changed from a search into a chase, the biological imperatives of the wolves overriding their training as the scent of their king's mate's blood hit their senses. Gwen scrambled to her feet, her head spinning as she tried to put more distance between herself and the approaching sound. The snow beneath her boots was no longer just a barrier. It was a canvas that tracked her every movement with a trail of red dots that she couldn't hide. She felt the tether in her chest pull even tighter, a physical sensation of dread that made her want to curl into a ball and wait for the end. The woods seemed to grow louder around her, the snapping of branches and the heavy thumping of paws becoming a rhythmic countdown to her capture. She didn't know if the king was the one leading the charge, or if it was Morgana's silent shadow, but she knew that the time for hiding had passed. The cold was a heavy weight on her shoulders, dragging her down as her blood continued to stain the earth. A sacrifice to the winter that refused to let her go. She pushed forward one last time, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum, unaware that the scent of her injury had just sent the Alpha King into a state of berserker fury. The balance of the night had shifted, and the snow was no longer just white. It was marked by the cost of a fated connection that refused to be ignored. Chapter 14. The eagle and the fox Fletcher knelt in the snow, his sharp, eagle-like eyes fixed on the dark red stain that marred the white expanse of the trail. The scent of blood was unmistakable, but it was the underlying sweetness of mountain laurel that made his stomach knot with a sudden, cold apprehension. He knew the king's mate was injured, and the knowledge sent a jolt of urgency through his entire unit. Beside him, the hounds were straining at their leashes, their muzzles covered in frost and their eyes gleaming with a frantic energy. Fletcher looked up, his gaze scanning the tree line for any sign of the girl, but he saw something else instead, a second set of tracks, lighter and more precise, that moved parallel to the main trail. These were the tracks of a warrior, someone who knew how to mask their scent and move through the forest without leaving a trace of their presence. The lead tracker felt a prickle of suspicion at the base of his neck, the intuitive sense that had earned him his position within the pack. He knew Morgana had been acting strangely since the roar had first echoed through the citadel, her jealousy a palpable force that even the lowest-ranking guards had noticed. If she had slipped away from the main hunt to find the girl first, her intentions were likely far from benevolent. Fletcher realized that he wasn't just tracking a frightened girl. He was in a race against a fox who intended to kill the prize before the eagle could claim it. He signaled to his men to pick up the pace, his voice a low, urgent command that brooked no argument. They couldn't afford to be slow, not when the life of the king's fated mate was hanging in the balance, and a traitor was likely closing the gap. As they moved deeper into the whispering woods, Fletcher began to notice signs of a struggle. Broken branches that hadn't been snapped by the wind, and the faint, lingering scent of a silver-tipped blade. The presence of silver in the forest was a grave insult to their kind, a weapon designed to kill shifters with a painful and permanent finality. It confirmed his worst fears about Morgana's involvement, filling him with a grim determination to reach the girl before the warrior could strike. He knew Fenris was somewhere behind them, his wolf driven mad by the scent of Gwen's blood. And if the king arrived to find his mate dead by the hand of one of his own warriors, the pack would never recover from the ensuing slaughter. The hunt was no longer just about finding a queen, it was about preventing a massacre. Fletcher pushed his men to their absolute limits, the cold air burning his lungs as they navigated the treacherous terrain. He could feel the proximity of the girl, her scent growing stronger and more desperate with every yard they gained. He also felt the presence of the fox, the silent predator who was circling her prey with a lethal patience. He was the eagle, the one who saw everything from above, and he would not allow the darkness of the forest to hide the truth of what was happening. He drew his own blade, not for the girl, but for the protection of the crown, his eyes fixed on the shadows ahead where the final confrontation was waiting to unfold. The race was nearing its end, and the fate of the Frostbane pack rested on his ability to outmaneuver a traitor in the heart of a winter storm. Chapter 15. A memory of Spring Fenris paused in the middle of a small clearing, his massive wolf form illuminated by the pale, ethereal light of the moon. He had shifted back into his human state for a brief moment, his body steaming in the freezing air as he pulled the restored journal from beneath his furs. He needed to hear her voice again, even if it was only through the medium of her work, to ground himself before the animalistic rage of his wolf took over completely. He opened the book to a random page near the end, his eyes landing on a poem his father had written for his mother during the earliest days of their mating. It was a piece of history he had never seen, a tender and vulnerable expression of love that had survived the fires of war and the passage of decades. The poem spoke of the first thaw of spring, the way the mountain laurel bloomed after a long winter, and the scent of rain brought life back to the parched earth. As Fenris read the words, the image of Gwen filled his mind, not as a frightened runaway, but as the woman who had painstakingly pieced these words back together so that he could read them. He realized that she had been reading this very poem while she worked, her fingers touching the same ink, and her heart feeling the same emotions that were now racing through his own. She hadn't just given him a book. She had given him a memory of a love that was possible even in a world as harsh as theirs. It was a promise of spring in the middle of the eternal frost, a reminder that his own heart was capable of more than just duty and command. The king closed the journal, his hands shaking as he realized how much he already loved the woman he had never even spoken to. She was the architect of his peace, the restorer of his family's soul, and she was currently bleeding in the snow because she was afraid of him. A wave of profound sadness washed over him, followed by a surge of protective instinct that made his wolf roar in his mind. He couldn't let her die thinking he was a monster. He had to show her that the scent of mountain laurel was the most precious thing in his world. He tucked the journal back into his tunic, the leather warm against his chest like a second heart, and prepared to shift once more. He wouldn't let the blizzard or the darkness take her from him. She was his spring, and he would find her even if he had to tear the forest apart with his bare hands. As the fur began to grow back along his spine, Fenris felt a sudden, sharp connection to Gwen, a pulse of fear and pain that traveled through the fated bond like a bolt of lightning. She was close, and she was in danger, not just from the cold, but from something else, something dark and predatory that was closing in on her. His wolf exploded into action, his four paws hitting the snow with a thunderous impact that echoed through the trees. He didn't care about the trackers or the hounds or the protocols of the pack. He only cared about the woman who smelled of rain. He was the king of the north, and he was coming to reclaim the piece of his soul that had been lost for too long. The memory of spring was his guide, and he would not rest until the laurel was safe in his arms. Chapter 16. The Interception. Gwen reached the edge of the frozen falls, where the mountains seemed to split open in a jagged, icy wound. The water that usually thundered over the precipice was now a static curtain of translucent blue, a monument to the relentless power of the northern winter. Her lungs felt as though they were filled with crushed glass, and the blood from her hand had begun to freeze against the fabric of her cloak. She looked back at the path she had taken, seeing nothing but the oppressive shadows of the trees and the swirling white of the blizzard. There was no soul in sight, yet the feeling of being hunted had grown into a physical pressure against her spine. She turned toward the narrow ledge that led around the base of the falls, her boots slipping on the slick surface as she fought to maintain her balance. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the gloom of the pines, moving with a terrifying, rhythmic precision that made Gwen's breath hitch. It was Morgana, her silver-armored shoulders catching the faint light of the moon as she stepped onto the frozen plateau. The warrior did not look like someone who had come to rescue a lost member of the pack. Her expression was one of cold, calculated malice. In her hand, she held a dagger that shimmered with the distinctive pale light of silver, its edge looking sharp enough to cut through the very air itself. Gwen felt a wave of icy dread wash over her, realizing that the danger she had been running from was far more personal than a misunderstood gift. The Alpha King's most trusted warrior was here to ensure that the secret of the mountain laurel died in the snow. Morgana spoke, her voice a low, lethal hiss that carried over the howling wind. She mocked Gwen's status, calling her a lowly scavenger who had dared to dream of a throne that was never meant for her. To Morgana, the fated bond was an inconvenience, a primitive biological error that threatened the stability of the kingdom she had worked so hard to preserve. She moved closer, the tip of her blade tracing a line in the air between them as she cornered Gwen against the wall of ice. There was no mercy in her eyes, only a ruthless determination to protect her own ambitions by eliminating the one person who had managed to catch the king's attention. Gwen backed away, her heel catching on the edge of a deep crevice in the ice as she realized she was trapped between a murderer and a vertical drop into the abyss. The warrior's laughter was a harsh, discordant sound that seemed to echo off the frozen waterfall. She stepped forward, her movements becoming faster and more aggressive as she prepared to finish what she had started. Gwen could feel the cold radiating from the ice behind her, but the heat of Morgana's hatred was far more dangerous than the sub-zero temperatures. The girl looked down at her bleeding hand, then back at the silver blade, knowing that no amount of pleading would change the outcome of this encounter. She was a restorer, a woman who spent her life fixing what was broken, but she had no tools to mend the fractured mind of a woman driven by jealousy. As Morgana raised the dagger for the final strike, the ice beneath them let out a low, ominous groan that vibrated through the soles of Gwen's boots. Chapter 17. The Choice of the Omega. Gwen's mind, honed by years of analyzing the structural integrity of ancient relics, suddenly shifted focus from her fear to the ground beneath her feet. She had spent a lifetime understanding how stone, leather, and ice responded to pressure and temperature, and the sound the plateau had just made told her exactly what she needed to know. The base of the frozen falls was not a solid mass of rock. It was a delicate shelf of accumulation, built up layer by layer throughout the winter. The recent blizzard had added a massive amount of weight to a structure that was already under stress from the shifting mountain beneath it. She looked at the pattern of cracks radiating from the center of the ice, realizing that they were standing on a shelf that was ready to collapse at the slightest provocation. Instead of cowering, Gwen straightened her back, her eyes meeting Morgana's with a newfound clarity. She knew she couldn't outfight a warrior of Morgana's caliber, but she could outthink her. The warrior was focused on her prey, her movements heavy and full of the arrogant confidence of the powerful, unaware of the environmental trap she had walked into. Gwen took a calculated step backward, deliberately moving toward a section of the ice where the fractures were most dense. The groaning sound intensified, a deep, resonant warning that the mountain was tired of holding its breath. Morgana hesitated for a fraction of a second, her wolf senses finally registering the instability, but her desire to see Gwen dead was a more powerful motivator than her survival instinct. "One more step," Morgana sneered, her grip tightening on the silver-tipped dagger as she adjusted her stance for the killing blow. Gwen didn't run. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs as she channeled every ounce of her remaining strength into her legs. She spoke for the first time, her voice surprisingly steady despite the freezing wind. She told Morgana that the mountain did not care for titles or fated bonds, only for the weight of those who stood upon it. The warrior's eyes narrowed in confusion, her blade beginning its downward arc, but Gwen was already moving. She dropped to her knees, shifting her center of gravity and slamming her fist into a particularly weak point in the ice she had identified moments before. The sound that followed was like the world itself splitting open. The shelf of ice didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, the entire plateau giving way beneath them with a deafening roar. Gwen felt herself falling, the sensation of weightlessness and cold air rushing past her as the ground vanished into the abyss. She reached out to grab a protruding piece of rock, her bleeding hand finding a precarious hold as the rest of the ice tumbled into the darkness below. Above her, Morgana let out a scream of fury and surprise, her heavy armor dragging her down as she struggled to find purchase on the crumbling ledge. The choice of the Omega had leveled the playing field, and as the dust of the collapse began to settle, the silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of the wind. Chapter 18. The king's primal instinct, Fenris, was no longer a man. He was a silver-white blur of fur and muscle that tore through the undergrowth with a speed that defied the limits of his physical form. His wolf was in a state of primal emergency, the scent of Gwen's blood acting as a catalyst that had pushed him past the point of reason. Every tree he passed, every rock he leaped over, was merely an obstacle in the way of his reclamation. He could feel her fear through the bond, a sharp vibration that made his own heart ache with a reflected agony. He had outrun Fletcher and the rest of the tracking unit miles ago, his lungs burning with the effort of maintaining a pace that would have killed a lesser wolf. He didn't care about his kingdom or his laws. He only cared about the woman who was currently bleeding in the heart of his territory. The scent of mountain laurel and fresh rain had been joined by the metallic tang of injury, a combination that made his wolf howl with a protective fury that shook the very trees. He could sense the presence of another shifter nearby, a scent that was familiar and yet tainted by a darkness he hadn't fully recognized until this moment. It was Morgana, her fragrance of cold steel and bitter pine cutting through the forest like a weapon. Fenris felt a snarl building in his chest as he realized his most trusted warrior was in the same area as his wounded mate. The piece of parchment he carried against his chest, the one with the sketch of his father's crest, seemed to burn with a phantom heat, reminding him of the gentleness he was currently fighting to preserve. He reached the edge of the clearing near the frozen falls, just as the sound of the ice collapsing echoed through the canyon. The vibration traveled through his paws, telling him that the very earth had given way beneath the feet of those he was hunting. His wolf didn't hesitate, launching himself forward into the cloud of snow and ice dust that filled the air. He could see the jagged remains of the plateau and the dark, yawning maw of the abyss where the ice had once been. His golden eyes scanned the wreckage, searching for the specific shade of a dark cloak or the glint of silver armor. The fated bond was screaming now, a direct line of communication that led his gaze toward a small, trembling figure clinging to a rocky ledge just below the rim of the precipice. Gwen was there, her fingers white and bloodied as she hung over the drop, her strength clearly at its absolute end. Below her, the darkness swallowed everything else, including any sign of Morgana or the silver blade. Fenris felt a surge of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen, the world slowing down as he prepared to make the leap that would decide their future. He didn't stop to shift back to human form. He knew that in this moment, the speed and power of the wolf were the only things that could save her. He was the king of stone and ice, but as he moved toward the edge of the abyss, he was merely a male who refused to let his mate fall into the void. The roar that escaped his throat was not one of command, but of a desperate, primal promise to hold her until the winter finally broke. Chapter 19. The confrontation at the falls. The dust from the collapse was still settling as Fenris reached the edge of the shattered ledge, his massive paws skidding on the remaining ice. He looked down to see Gwen hanging by her fingertips, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange flickering hope as she recognized the silver-white wolf above her. Below her, the gorge was a dark abyss filled with the jagged remains of the waterfall, a graveyard of ice that had claimed everything else. To her left, Morgana had managed to catch herself on a lower outcropping, her face contorted with a mask of pure hatred. The warrior's silver dagger was still clutched in her hand, the blade glowing with a malevolent light as she prepared to lunge upward toward Gwen's exposed legs. Fenris didn't hesitate. He shifted mid-air as he lunged over the edge, the transition from wolf to man a violent explosion of fur and flesh. He landed on a narrow shelf of rock just above Gwen, his fingers digging into the stone with a strength that caused the mountain to groan. With his other hand, he reached down and grabbed Gwen by the waist, hauling her upward with a single, powerful surge of his muscles. The girl let out a sob of relief as she was pulled against the hard, warm wall of his chest. The scent of the king, cedarwood and ancient power, finally overwhelming the smell of the cold. Fenris shielded her body with his own, his gaze fixing on Morgana with a lethal intensity that caused even the hardened warrior to flinch. The betrayal was laid bare in the dim light of the moon, the silver dagger in Morgana's hand serving as an irrefutable confession of her intent. She tried to speak, her voice a desperate attempt to frame her actions as a service to the pack, but the king wasn't listening to her lies. He saw the marks of her pursuit on Gwen's face, and the blood on his mate's hand, and the rage that filled him was colder than any blizzard. Morgana realized then that she had lost everything: her position, her honor, and the king she had hoped to claim. In a final act of desperation, she lunged with the dagger, hoping to at least take the girl with her into the darkness. But Fenris was faster. He didn't even use a weapon. He used the sheer force of his alpha command, a vocal vibration that struck Morgana like a physical blow. The warrior's grip failed as the power of the command shattered her resolve, the silver dagger slipping from her fingers and falling into the depths below. She scrambled for purchase on the slick rock, but the ice beneath her had been compromised by the earlier collapse. With a final, echoing cry of frustration, the ledge she was holding onto gave way, sending her plummeting after her blade into the shadows of the gorge. Fenris didn't watch her fall. His focus was entirely on the trembling woman in his arms. He pulled Gwen further back onto the stable rock, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized how close he had come to losing her. The silence that followed was absolute, the hunt finally over, leaving only the two of them alone on the edge of the broken world. Chapter 20. The Alpha's Protection. Fenris held Gwen against him as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of shadows and wind. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic pulse that matched the frantic tempo of his own. He didn't care that he was standing nearly naked in the freezing cold, his clothes having been sacrificed to the shift. The heat of the fated bond was radiating from him like a furnace, providing a sanctuary of warmth that defied the winter. He looked down at the woman who had saved his soul with a book, his large hands trembling as he brushed a stray frost-covered lock of hair from her face. Her eyes were fixed on his, searching for the monster she thought she had offended. But all she found was a man who looked at her with a reverence that bordered on worship. He didn't speak at first, instead choosing to wrap his heavy fur mantle around her shoulders, the thick pelt still carrying the scent of his wolf. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, and the way her hand continued to bleed against his tunic, and the sight made him pull her even closer. He whispered her name, or what he imagined it to be, his voice a low, soothing rumble that finally began to still her chattering teeth. He told her that she was safe, that the hunt was over, and that no soul in the Frostbane pack would ever cause her a moment of fear again. The Alpha's protection was not just a promise. It was a physical reality, an unseen wall of dominance that he had erected around her the moment he had touched her skin. Gwen looked up at him, the terror in her eyes slowly being replaced by a profound sense of recognition. The tether she had felt for years was now a tangible connection, a bridge between their spirits that had finally been crossed. She realized that the king's roar hadn't been an act of fury, but a cry of primal recognition, a signal to the world that his queen had been found. She reached out with her uninjured hand and touched the scarred skin of his chest, her fingers tracing the path of the fated bond that lived within him. The scent of mountain laurel was all around them, a fragrance of spring that had survived the most brutal night of the year, marking the beginning of a new chapter for the king and the girl who understood his heart. The tracking unit, led by Fletcher, finally arrived at the edge of the clearing, their torches casting a warm, orange glow over the scene. They found their king standing on the edge of the abyss, his arms wrapped around a small, dark-cloaked woman who looked like a fragile miracle against the backdrop of the ice. No one moved or spoke. They simply lowered their heads in a gesture of absolute submission to the pair. The claim had been made, and the news would travel through the territory faster than the blizzard, telling the story of the Alpha King who had been saved by a gift, and the girl who had brought the spring to the north. Fenris picked Gwen up in his arms, his steps steady and purposeful as he began the long walk back to the citadel, leaving the darkness of the woods behind forever.